Thomas Granger, a quiet 74-year-old Marine veteran, is arrested for assault after intervening in a heated argument at the Veterans Memorial he faithfully tends. Handcuffed and misjudged, Tom faces a courtroom ready to convict him based on shaky evidence. But as the trial unfolds, a four-star general arrives, revealing Tom's hidden past as a war hero who saved lives with a single shot. New evidence exposes the truth, turning accusers into admirers. With the case dismissed, Tom's honor is restored. But what secrets does this silent guardian still hold? The story leaves you wondering who else walks unnoticed among us. Love stories of unsung heroes like Tom Granger? Subscribe to for more tales of quiet courage. Share your city below and hit that subscribe button if you believe justice delayed is still justice. Support our channel to keep these inspiring stories alive. Thomas Granger, at 74, carried the invisible scars of a life shaped by duty and loss. For 11 years, he had tended to the Veterans Memorial in Memorial Square, a quiet corner of the city where granite and bronze stood as solemn tributes to those who never returned. His body ached with the toll of time, arthritic knees, a back that groaned under the weight of decades, but his hands remained steady, guided by purpose. Each morning at precisely 0700 hours, Tom arrived at the modest monument nestled between the courthouse and the public library. It wasn't a grand structure, just a simple stone engraved with names of local heroes, their sacrifices etched in fading letters. Most passers-by barely noticed it, their footsteps hurried, their eyes elsewhere. But for Tom, the memorial was a sacred space, a tether to a past he rarely spoke of, a place where he could honor the fallen in silence. In his worn canvas bag, Tom carried the tools of his quiet devotion, a soft brush to trace the carved names, metal polish to keep the bronze plaque gleaming, and, when his modest pension allowed, a small bouquet of fresh flowers to lay at the stone's base. His movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as if each stroke of the brush was a prayer. Each polished surface, a way to keep the memory of those names alive. To the townsfolk, Tom was a fixture, a veteran whose military bearing, regulation haircut, flag folded with precision each evening, hinted at a past of service. But the details, the wars, the battles, the moments that haunted his dreams, remained locked away, buried deep in a heart that had learned to guard its secrets. On that chilly Tuesday morning in March, Tom was kneeling by the memorial, his hands working the bronze plaque with care, when the sharp edge of raised voices broke his focus. Two young men, college age, stood nearby, their words heated and tangled. Something about politics, Tom guessed, though he couldn't make out the details. Their voices clashed like static, disrupting the quiet reverence of the square. "Keep it down, boys," Tom said softly, his eyes still on the plaque, his tone calm but firm. "Some folks are trying to honor people who can't speak for themselves anymore." His words were a gentle nudge, a plea for respect, but they carried the weight of a man who understood loss in ways the young men couldn't fathom. The taller of the two, dressed in a wrinkled t-shirt and sneakers that cost more than Tom's monthly pension, went on toward him, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Mind your own business, old man," he snapped. "This is a public space." Tom's hands paused, but he didn't look up. "It is," he agreed, his voice steady as he resumed polishing. "Which is why we all need to respect it." The argument flared louder, drawing curious glances from pedestrians. Some stopped to watch, their phones half raised, sensing a spectacle. Others crossed the street, eager to avoid the brewing tension. Tom's knees ached as he rose slowly, his body protesting the effort. When he stood to his full height, there was something in his posture, a quiet strength, a presence that suggested he was not a man to be dismissed. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority, "I'm asking nicely. Take your discussions somewhere else." His words were polite, but they held an edge, a reminder of a man who had faced far worse than a pair of hot-headed youths. The shorter young man, emboldened by the crowd, stepped forward, his stance aggressive. "Or what?" he sneered. "You'll call security? Look around, Grandpa. You're all alone here." Tom's gaze shifted, catching movement in the distance. A third figure, a young woman, approaching quickly, her phone clutched tightly, her face flushed with agitation. He recognized the signs: elevated pulse, Narrowed focus, a decision about to be made, likely a poor one. His instincts, honed by years of survival, kicked in. "Move aside," Tom said, stepping between the arguing pair and the approaching woman, his voice calm but resolute. What happened next would later be dissected in a courtroom, twisted by conflicting accounts. The young woman, a stranger to Tom, claimed she was only trying to intervene when he pushed her, causing her to stumble and scrape her knee on the pavement. The two young men, suddenly united against a common foe, backed her story, their voices loud with indignation. Within 3 minutes, the wail of sirens cut through the square. Within 5, Tom was pressed against the memorial he had tended for over a decade, his hands cuffed behind his back, the cold metal biting into his wrists as onlookers raised their phones to capture the scene. "Assault and battery," the young officer declared, his voice puffed with self-importance. "Unprovoked attack on a civilian." Tom said nothing, his silence a shield forged long ago in moments when words failed and truth felt irrelevant. As they led him to the patrol car, he stole one last glance at the memorial. His canvas bag lay abandoned, cleaning supplies scattered across the ground like relics of a life interrupted. His daily ritual, his quiet act of devotion, was shattered in an instant. The county courthouse holding cell was a familiar kind of confinement, cold, stark, and unyielding. Tom had been in worse places, faced worse odds, but the sting of this moment cut deeper. He sat on the hard bench, his thoughts drifting to the names on the memorial, to the lives they represented, and to the past he had never shared, not even now when it might have mattered most. The cold metal bench pressed against Tom Granger's back as he sat in the holding cell, his posture ramrod straight, as though he were awaiting inspection rather than a court appearance. His hands rested neatly folded in his lap, fingers interlaced with a quiet precision that spoke of discipline, of years spent mastering control. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, fixed on the cracked paint of the opposite wall, as if it held secrets only he could decipher. The other detainees, a motley assortment of restless souls, kept their distance. There was something about Tom's stillness, a heavy unspoken weight, that made them uneasy. It wasn't just his age, though his silver hair and lined face marked him as older than most in the room. It was the depth behind his gaze, a silent reservoir of experience that seemed to warn against probing too closely. They sensed it instinctively, like animals avoiding a storm they couldn't name. When David Martinez, the public defender, arrived, Tom barely shifted. Martinez was young, his tie slightly askew, his briefcase stuffed with files that screamed of an overworked life. His eyes carried the exhaustion of someone already mentally juggling the next case while standing in front of this one. He flipped open a manila folder, glancing at the name scrawled on the tab. "Mr. Granger," he said, his voice clipped but professional. "I'm David Martinez, your attorney for today. Good news up front. The injuries to Miss Henderson are minor. We're likely looking at community service if we can negotiate a plea deal. It's a solid option, all things considered." Tom's response came softly, almost too quiet to carry weight, yet it landed like a stone in still water. "I won't be pleading to anything." His tone was steady, not defiant, but resolute, as if the decision had been carved into him long ago. Martinez blinked, caught off guard. He was used to elderly clients grasping at any chance to avoid the inside of a cell, their voices trembling with fear of confinement or shame. But Tom? Tom sat there like a man who'd already faced worse than a jail cot. "Sir," Martinez said, leaning forward, his voice lowering as if to coax reason into the conversation. "With all due respect, they have you on video. Multiple witnesses saw you push Miss Henderson. The officer's report is crystal clear on what happened." Tom's eyes met Martinez's for the first time, calm and unyielding. "The report's accurate about what he saw," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned to measure words carefully. "Doesn't mean it's true." Martinez frowned, his fingers tapping the edge of his folder. He'd heard plenty of defendants claim innocence, but this was different. There was no desperation in Tom's voice, no pleading, just a quiet certainty that made the young lawyer pause. "Mr. Granger, in court, the truth isn't always what matters. It's about what can be proven. They've got video evidence, witness statements, and a police report. That's a mountain to climb. What do we have to counter it?" Tom studied Martinez's face, his gaze piercing but not unkind. He saw the earnestness in the young man's eyes, the flicker of idealism not yet fully extinguished by the grind of the system. "We have the truth," Tom said simply. "Sometimes, that's got to be enough." 2 hours later, Tom sat at the defendant's table in Judge Patricia Walker's courtroom, his hands still folded, his posture unchanged from the holding cell. He wore the same clothes he had had on that morning at the war memorial, a plain button-up shirt and slacks, both slightly wrinkled but clean, as if he'd dressed with care for a solemn occasion. The courtroom hummed with a subdued energy, a mix of curiosity and judgment. Word had spread quickly about the crazy old man who'd attacked a young woman at the memorial, and the gallery was dotted with spectators, some clutching phones, hoping to catch a moment dramatic enough to go viral. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. "Case number 2024, CR 11447, People versus Thomas Granger, assault and battery in the fourth degree." Judge Walker, perched behind her bench, glanced at Tom with a look that carried the weight of years spent presiding over similar scenes. Her expression suggested she'd already sized him up. Another elderly defendant, probably acting out for attention or lost in some fog of delusion. She'd seen it before, too many times. The prosecution's case unfolded with practiced efficiency. Officer Bradley Patterson took the stand first, his uniform crisp, his demeanor confident but not cocky. He described arriving at the war memorial to find a chaotic scene, a crowd buzzing with outrage, several witnesses pointing to Tom as the man who'd pushed Sarah Henderson to the ground without provocation. "It was clear from the statements and the video footage," Patterson said, his voice steady, "that Mr. Granger initiated physical contact. The victim was attempting to de-escalate a situation when he shoved her." Next came Sarah Henderson herself, her knee wrapped in a bandage that seemed more theatrical than necessary. She was young, with a polished appearance that suggested she knew how to play to an audience. As she settled into the witness stand, her eyes darted briefly to the gallery, as if gauging how many were watching. "I was just trying to help," she said, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. "There was an argument, and I stepped in to calm things down. That's when he turned on me. His posture, his eyes. I've never been so scared in my life. He looked so angry, so dangerous." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, letting the moment linger. "Then he pushed me. Hard. I fell, and I didn't know what he'd do next." The prosecution played the cell phone video, and the courtroom fell silent as the grainy footage flickered on the screen. It showed Tom's hands making contact with Henderson's shoulders, followed by her stumble and fall. The clip was short, devoid of context, but the physical act was unmistakable. Whispers rippled through the gallery, and a few jurors leaned forward, their expressions hardening. To them, the evidence was damning. Tom remained still throughout, his face a mask of calm. Martinez, seated beside him, leaned in, whispering urgently, likely pushing for a plea deal to mitigate the damage. But Tom's expression never wavered, as if he were observing a play he already knew the ending to. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Walker said, her voice cutting through the room's tension, "does your client wish to enter a plea?" Before Martinez could respond, Tom rose to his feet, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and steady, "I don't need anyone to speak for me. They'll remember me or they won't." His words hung in the air, cryptic and heavy, sending a ripple of confusion through the courtroom. Spectators exchanged glances, some smirking, others frowning. What was he talking about? Who would remember him? Judge Walker's brow furrowed, her patience visibly thinning. "Mr. Granger, I strongly advise you to consult with your attorney before speaking further." "With respect, Your Honor," Tom replied, his tone neither defiant nor apologetic. "I've said all I intend to say." He sat down, his hands returning to their folded position, his gaze settling somewhere beyond the courtroom walls. In the jury box, a few jurors whispered among themselves, their impatience palpable. "Why's he standing like that?" one muttered, nodding toward Tom's rigid posture. "Like he's still in the military or something." "Probably stolen valor," another replied, rolling his eyes. "My brother says old guys like him fake being soldiers all the time to get sympathy." In the gallery, Marcus Collins, a teenager slouched in his seat, had been half-heartedly watching the proceedings while texting his father. But something about Tom's demeanor, the way he held himself, the quiet defiance in his silence, caught his attention. Marcus lowered his phone, his thumbs pausing over the screen. There was something different about this old man, something that didn't fit the narrative of a cranky retiree lashing out. Marcus couldn't place it, but it stirred a flicker of curiosity, a sense that there was more to this story than the grainy video and tearful testimony suggested. Tom, for his part, seemed untouched by the courtroom's judgment. His thoughts drifted inward, to memories of other battles, other moments when the truth had been buried under the weight of what could be proven. He'd faced worse than this, a small-town courtroom, a young woman's theatrics, a jury ready to convict. He'd faced moments when the stakes were life and death, when the truth had been all he had to hold on to. And now, sitting here, he felt that same quiet resolve. They could judge him, label him, condemn him, but the truth, that was his, and no one could take it away. The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of anticipation, the kind that settles over a room when routine proceedings teeter on the edge of something unexpected. Marcus, a young law student seated in the gallery, couldn't tear his eyes away from the defendant, Tom Granger. There was something about the old man's posture, rigid yet unyielding, like a weathered oak standing firm against the storm. The faint glint of metal at Tom's neck caught Marcus's attention, a chain barely visible beneath the collar of his worn shirt. Squinting, Marcus raised his phone, zooming in on the blurry image until he could just make out the shape of military dog tags. His heart quickened with curiosity, a nagging sense that this detail was more than it seemed. Fingers trembling slightly, he snapped a photo and sent it to his father with a message. "Dad, something strange is happening at this trial. Do these look like real military dog tags to you?" Across town, Captain Robert Collins, a retired Marine with 30 years of service etched into his weathered frame, sat in a meeting, his mind half engaged with the corporate jargon swirling around him. His phone vibrated, and Marcus's message lit up the screen. The image stopped him cold. He excused himself, his voice clipped, betraying none of the urgency that gripped his chest. Stepping into the hallway, he enlarged the photo, his eyes tracing the defendant's broad shoulders, the way they squared instinctively, as if still answering to a drill sergeant's command. The dog tags were the final clue. Robert knew that posture, that bearing. It wasn't something a civilian could mimic convincingly. This man wasn't playing a role. He was a Marine. A flood of memories, grueling deployments, the weight of lives carried on his shoulders, surged through Robert, tightening his jaw. He stepped outside, the crisp air grounding him as he dialed a number few possessed, a direct line to an old comrade who owed him a debt. "Sir," he said when the call connected, his voice steady but urgent, "I need you to run a name through the classified database. Thomas Granger, approximately 74, appears to be former military." 18 minutes later, a sleek black SUV with government plates rolled up to the courthouse, its presence as subtle as a thunderclap. The vehicle bore no markings, but its occupant carried an authority that silenced the bustling street with a single raised hand. Pedestrians froze, their curiosity piqued by the figure who emerged. General David Kern, at 62, moved with the precision of a man who had never lost a battle that mattered. The 4 stars on his shoulders gleamed in the sunlight, a silent testament to a career forged in fire. His stride toward the courthouse was deliberate, each step radiating purpose. Onlookers whispered, their gazes lingering on the man who seemed to command the very air around him. Inside, the trial churned forward with mechanical efficiency. The prosecution had rested, their case airtight. The defense had waived evidence, a move that left the gallery murmuring with confusion. Judge Walker, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing, was preparing jury instructions, her pen scratching across the page. The case was simple. An elderly man, Tom Granger, accused of assault, sat destined for conviction. Tom Granger sat motionless at the defendant's table, his hands cuffed, his face an unreadable mask. At 74, his frame was lean but unbowed, his eyes carrying a quiet defiance that unsettled those who met his gaze. He didn't fidget or glance around like others might. He simply was, as if the courtroom, the cuffs, the accusations were mere inconveniences. The jurors, already mentally tallying their verdict, cast occasional glances his way, their expressions a mix of pity and judgment. In the front row, Ms. Henderson, the alleged victim, sat with her bandaged knee prominently displayed, her face a study in calculated distress. Every so often, she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her movements practiced, eliciting sympathetic murmurs from those nearby. Her heart raced with a mix of vindication and unease. She'd been wronged, hadn't she? Yet something about Tom's stillness gnawed at her. A flicker of doubt she quickly suppressed. The courtroom door opened with a soft creak, and General Kern entered, his dress blue uniform adorned with ribbons and medals that told a story of sacrifice in places most only read about. The room fell silent, the weight of his presence pulling every eye toward him. Conversations died mid-sentence, even the rustle of papers stilled. Judge Walker looked up, her pen pausing as recognition flashed across her face. She'd seen this man before, on television, testifying before Congress, his voice steady as he outlined the strategies behind Operation Eagle Flame, the counterterrorism campaign that had reshaped a decade. Her pulse quickened, a rare moment of uncertainty creeping into her usually unflappable demeanor. "Your Honor," General Kern said, his voice clear and resonant, cutting through the silence like a blade. "I apologize for the interruption, but I have information relevant to this case." The prosecutor, a young man with ambition in his eyes, shot to his feet, his voice tinged with unease. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The case is nearly concluded." Judge Walker's gaze didn't waver from the general. "Sit down," she said, her tone firm, brooking no argument. "General Kern, please approach the bench." As Kern moved forward, his polished shoes clicking softly on the floor, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every person rose instinctively. Lawyers, spectators, even the bailiff, except Tom Granger. He remained seated, his cuffed hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Then, in a moment that seemed to suspend time, General Kern stopped before the defendant's table, snapped to attention, and rendered a crisp military salute directly to Tom. The gesture was precise, reverent, a recognition of something deeper than the courtroom could contain. The silence that followed was electric, heavy with unspoken questions. The hum of the air conditioning and the faint rumble of traffic outside, the soft intake of breath from those watching. It all seemed amplified in the stillness. Tom, his hands still bound, met Kern's gaze. With a slight nod, he returned the salute, a subtle acknowledgement that carried the weight of shared history, of battles fought and burdens carried. In that moment, the courtroom faded. The accusations, the jury, the bandages on Miss Henderson's knee. For Tom, it was a fleeting connection to a past he'd buried, a spark of pride reigniting in his chest. For Kern, it was a debt honored, a recognition of a man whose sacrifices had gone unseen for too long. Judge Walker, her composure shaken, cleared her throat. "General," she said, her voice betraying a trace of uncertainty, "please explain the relevance of your presence here." In the hushed tension of the courtroom, General Kern turned to face the gathered assembly, his weathered face etched with resolve. His voice, steady yet laced with a deep undercurrent of reverence, carried the weight of decades spent in service. He gestured toward the man seated at the defendant's table, a figure whose quiet demeanor belied a lifetime of sacrifice. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence of one of the most exemplary Marines to ever wear the uniform of our nation. This is Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Granger, United States Marine Corps, a veteran of 3 harrowing tours in Vietnam and 2 covert operations so sensitive I am forbidden to speak of them here." The prosecutor, a wiry man with a pinched expression, began to rise in objection, but General Kern's raised hand, firm, commanding, silenced him before a word could escape. General Kern's gaze drifted back to 1971, to a memory seared into his soul. His voice grew quieter yet more intense as he recounted the chaos of Operation Dewey Canyon 3. "As a young corporal, Tom Granger was attached to my unit as a designated marksman. We were trapped in a narrow valley near the DMZ, pinned down by relentless enemy fire. Our men were falling, wounded or worse, with no hope of evacuation. Despair hung heavy over us. His eyes, momentarily distant, flickered with the raw emotion of that day, the acrid smoke, the cries of the wounded, the suffocating fear of imminent death. It was Tom, then just a corporal, who spotted the enemy sniper who had us in his crosshairs. From an unimaginable distance, under conditions that would have broken most men, wind, rain, and the weight of our dwindling chances, he took a single shot. One bullet. That shot ended the sniper's reign of terror and saved 17 lives. He paused, his voice catching ever so slightly as he turned to face Tom directly. Including mine. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, the air thick with the gravity of the general's words. Jurors who moments ago had regarded Tom with suspicion now stared openly, their preconceptions unraveling. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, as if seeing the defendant for the first time. Others exchanged glances, their earlier certainty replaced by doubt. Ms. Henderson, the alleged victim, sat rigidly at the prosecution's table, her face a mask of confusion and unease. Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap, betraying the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. She had entered this trial convinced of her narrative, but now, confronted by the general's unwavering testimony, cracks began to form in her resolve. Sensing the tide shifting, General Kern reached into his jacket with deliberate care, producing a small velvet box that gleamed softly in the courtroom's fluorescent light. After that operation, Tom vanished from our unit, whisked away to classified missions that exist only in the shadows of military records. For 30 years I searched for him, driven by a debt I could never repay. He opened the box, revealing a silver star, its polished surface catching the light like a beacon. A murmur rippled through the room. This is the medal Tom should have received in 1971. Political maneuvering and the secrecy of his subsequent assignments buried the ceremony he deserved. Until today. With measured steps, General Kern approached Tom's table, his boots echoing faintly on the polished floor. He stood before the handcuffed Marine, his eyes locking with Tom's. If this man is a criminal, then I have spent my entire career following the example of a criminal, and I would do so again without hesitation. His words hung in the air, a challenge to the room's lingering doubts. Judge Walker, a woman whose stern demeanor had governed the trial with unyielding fairness, leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence. General, are you suggesting the defendant is not the man the prosecution claims him to be? Her tone was cautious, probing, as if she too felt the ground shifting beneath the case. General Kern's response was immediate, his voice resolute. I'm saying Thomas Granger is exactly who he appears to be, a Marine who has dedicated his life to protecting others, expecting nothing in return. He turned to Tom, his gaze softening with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. For 11 years, Tom has tended a memorial outside this very courthouse. That memorial bears the names of men from our unit, brothers whose sacrifices were never fully acknowledged, whose families never learned the truth of their courage or the man who saved them when they lay bleeding in the dirt. His voice dropped to a near whisper, thick with emotion. Tom has stood guard over their memory, not because anyone ordered him to, but because Marines don't abandon their own. Not in war, not in peace, Baum. For the first time since the trial began, Tom spoke, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. The memorial needed tending. No one else stepped up. The words were simple, unadorned, yet they carried the weight of a man who had lived by duty alone. In his weathered face, General Kern saw the same quiet resolve that had steadied their unit in that valley decades ago. Tom's eyes, though shadowed by years of unspoken burdens, held no trace of self-pity. He had done what needed doing, as always. General Kern nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That's Tom, always stepping into the breach, never asking for a spotlight. He turned back to Judge Walker, his posture straightening with purpose. Your Honor, I request permission to present evidence that will shed light on the events in question. The judge, her expression unreadable, gave a slow nod. The court will hear your evidence, General. At his gesture, two Marines in crisp dress uniforms entered through the courtroom's heavy doors, their presence commanding immediate attention. They carried file folders thick with documents in a case containing surveillance equipment. General Kern's voice rose with quiet authority. The incident at the memorial was captured by 3 security cameras. The footage shows Gunnery Sergeant Granger positioning himself between 2 agitated individuals to prevent a physical altercation. When Ms. Henderson approached rapidly from behind, Tom moved instinctively to intercept what he perceived as a potential threat to bystanders. The prosecutor, his confidence visibly shaken, rose to his feet, his voice thin and faltering. Your Honor, this is compelling theater, but it doesn't erase the fact that the defendant made physical contact with Ms. Henderson. His words, meant to reclaim control, sounded hollow in the wake of the general's testimony. General Kern's smile was grim, his eyes sharp. You're correct. It doesn't change that fact. It explains it. He nodded to the Marines, who began setting up a laptop and projector with practiced efficiency. What the cell phone video failed to capture, what no witness fully understood, is that Tom wasn't attacking Ms. Henderson. He was protecting her from stumbling into a situation that was moments away from turning violent. The security footage began to play, its grainy clarity projected onto a screen for all to see. The courtroom watched, transfixed, as the events unfolded in stark detail. Tom, standing near the memorial, moved with calm precision to separate two individuals whose raised voices and clenched fists signaled imminent conflict. Ms. Henderson, unaware of the escalating tension, approached from behind, her pace hurried and her expression distracted. In a split second, Tom turned, his body shifting to block her path, not with aggression, but with the instinctive protectiveness of a man who had spent his life shielding others from harm. As the video ended, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of the truth settling over the room like a heavy fog. General Kern stood tall, his voice steady but imbued with quiet conviction. This is who Thomas Granger is. Not a criminal, but a guardian. A Marine who even now acts not for himself, but for others. In that moment, Tom sat quietly, his hands still bound, his gaze fixed on some distant point. Yet beneath his stoic exterior, a flicker of something stirred, a quiet acknowledgement of the brothers he had never forgotten, and the man who had finally come to stand at his side. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the video footage played, projected from an elevated angle that laid bare every moment of the incident. Tom Granger's actions unfolded on the screen, each movement deliberate and precise, revealing a man not driven by malice, but by instinct honed over years of service. His broad shoulders, slightly hunched with age, moved with purpose as he gently guided Ms. Henderson away from the escalating chaos. What had been labeled a violent assault in the initial reports now appeared as a careful, almost tender act of protection. Tom's hands, weathered but steady, had touched her arm with the lightest pressure, steering her from danger with the same calm resolve he'd once shown on battlefields far from this small-town courthouse. His eyes, sharp despite the lines etched around them, scanned the scene, assessing threats with a clarity that only years of training could instill. Inside, Tom's mind churned. He hadn't wanted any of this. The accusations, the handcuffs, the weight of a courtroom scrutiny. He'd only acted to keep someone safe, as he always had, but now he sat, wrist-bound, feeling the sting of being misunderstood. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into his skin, a reminder of how quickly truth could be buried under assumptions. Yet, even as frustration simmered, a quiet pride anchored him. He'd done what was right, just as he'd been taught, just as he'd done countless times before in places where hesitation meant death. General Kern, seated in the gallery, watched the footage with a tightness in his chest. He'd known Tom for decades, had seen him charge into danger without a second thought, and now here he was, reduced to a defendant in a system that didn't know his worth. The general's weathered face betrayed a flicker of guilt. He should have found Tom sooner, should have ensured a man of his caliber wasn't left to fade into obscurity. What Tom saw was a rapidly deteriorating situation with civilians at risk. Kern explained to the court, his voice steady but laced with conviction. He did exactly what his training demanded. He protected innocent people. Each word carried the weight of truth, a truth Kern wished he'd shouted sooner, before Tom had been forced to endure this ordeal. The courtroom fell silent as the video ended, the air thick with realization. Ms. Henderson, who had testified against Tom with such certainty, now sat pale and shaken. Her earlier words, spoken with the confidence of someone who believed she'd been wronged, crumbled in the face of the footage. Doubt crept into her mind, twisting her thoughts. Had she misjudged him so completely? Her hands trembled in her lap, her face a mask of confusion and regret as she replayed the moment in her head, seeing it now not as an attack but as a rescue she hadn't understood. Judge Walker, her expression unreadable, called for a brief recess. The decision wasn't just procedural. She needed time to grapple with the shift in her own understanding. As the room emptied, she remained at her bench, staring at the blank screen, her mind racing. She presided over countless cases, but this one had unraveled her assumptions. Tom wasn't just an elderly man caught in a misunderstanding. He was a hero, and she'd nearly let the system fail him. General Kern approached Tom, who sat motionless, the handcuffs a stark contrast to the dignity in his posture. "Tom," Kern said softly, his voice heavy with remorse, "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you." The words carried years of unspoken apologies, a recognition that men like Tom were too often left to carry their burdens alone. Tom looked up, his eyes holding a lifetime of stories, battles fought, losses endured, and a quiet resilience that had never wavered. "You didn't need to find me, sir," he replied, his voice low but steady. "I wasn't lost." There was no bitterness in his tone, only the calm acceptance of a man who'd long ago made peace with being overlooked. Kern shook his head, a faint smile breaking through his guilt. "Maybe not, Tom, but you were forgotten, and that's on all of us." Near the back of the courtroom, Officer Patterson stood frozen, his earlier confidence shattered. The swagger he'd carried when he arrested Tom, convinced he was apprehending a threat, had evaporated. Now he saw the man he'd cuffed in a new light, not a suspect, but a war hero whose actions had been misread. His stomach churned with unease, his face flushed with the weight of his mistake. He'd acted on what he thought he knew, but the truth had exposed his error in stark clarity. When General Kern called him over, Patterson approached with the hesitancy of a man facing judgment. "Sir, I had no idea who he was," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "The witnesses all said, 'You did your job based on the information you had,'" Kern interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "No one's faulting you for that, but now you have different information. What matters now is how you respond to new facts." The words hit Patterson like a reprimand and a lesson all at once. He nodded, swallowing hard, vowing silently to carry this moment with him, to let it shape how he approached his duties from now on. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had transformed. Word of the morning's revelations had spread like wildfire, drawing courthouse employees, local attorneys, and curious citizens to the gallery. They whispered among themselves, their eyes fixed on Tom, who sat quietly, still bearing the weight of the cuffs, but with a dignity that seemed to fill the room. Judge Walker returned, her posture reflecting a newfound resolve. She'd spent the recess reevaluating everything, her earlier assumptions about the case now replaced by a humbling clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and deliberate, "in light of new evidence and testimony, I am instructing you to disregard the prosecution's case as presented. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Granger acted not as an aggressor, but as a protector." She turned to the prosecutor, her gaze steady. "Does the state wish to continue with these charges?" The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney who knew when a case was lost, stood and shook his head, his expression resigned. "The state moves to dismiss all charges, Your Honor." Judge Walker nodded, striking her gavel with a single resolute blow. "Motion granted. Mr. Granger, you are free to go." She paused, her eyes softening as they met Tom's. "Officer Patterson, please remove Mr. Granger's restraints immediately." Patterson moved quickly, his hands trembling as he unlocked the handcuffs. The metal fell away, and Tom flexed his wrists, the sensation of freedom both physical and profound. "Sir," Patterson said quietly, his voice thick with sincerity, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Tom looked at him, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that disarmed the young officer. "You couldn't have known, son," he said gently, "but now you do." As Tom stood, General Kern approached, a velvet box in his hands. The room seemed to hold its breath as he opened it, revealing the silver star, its gleam a testament to a life of sacrifice. "Tom, this is long overdue," Kern said, his voice steady but emotional. He pinned the medal to Tom's plain shirt, the same worn fabric he'd entered the courtroom in that morning. The silver star transformed him, not into someone new, but into the man he'd always been. A decorated veteran whose quiet heroism had finally been seen. Kern turned to the courtroom, his voice ringing with pride. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Granger, Silver Star recipient, Purple Heart recipient, and one of the finest Marines I have ever served alongside. The room erupted in spontaneous applause, a wave of sound that seemed to lift Tom from the weight of the morning's ordeal. Judge Walker stood behind her bench, her hands clasped, a rare smile breaking through her judicial demeanor. Officer Patterson snapped to attention, offering a crisp salute, his earlier shame giving way to respect. Even the court reporter, her fingers poised over her machine, paused to join the applause. Tom stood quietly amid the ovation, his expression calm but his heart full, a man who had never sought recognition but now felt its warmth, a long-delayed acknowledgement of a life lived with honor. The air in Memorial Square carried a subtle shift, a quiet reverence that hadn't been there before. Thomas Granger, once unnoticed in his faded jacket and worn boots, now moved with a military precision that drew eyes. His broad shoulders squared instinctively, and the measured cadence of his steps betrayed the Marine he'd always been, though it took the town's belated awakening to see it. The newfound attention unsettled him. Tom wasn't one for crowds or praise, yet he bore it with a quiet grace, the kind forged in battles fought far from home and in the silent struggles of a life lived for others. Each nod of respect, each murmured thank you, landed on him like a weight, not of burden, but of duty fulfilled. He'd earned it, not by seeking it, but by never wavering from who he was. Across the square, Ms. Henderson lingered near a bench, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse. The bandage on her knee, once a stark symbol of her accusation, now seemed almost performative, a prop in a drama that had unraveled. Her steps toward Tom were halting, each one a battle against the shame that churned inside her. She'd spent sleepless nights replaying that day in the park. Her fear, the blur of motion, the man reaching out. What she'd seen as a threat had been Tom's attempt to steady her as she stumbled. The truth, once so clear in her panic, now felt like a betrayal of her own making. "Mr. Granger," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of her regret. She searched his face, expecting anger, but found only calm. "I'm so sorry. I got it wrong. I misunderstood everything." Tom's eyes, weathered by years and wars, studied her for a long moment. He saw the guilt etched in her furrowed brow, the way her shoulders hunched as if bracing for judgment. He'd known fear himself, on battlefields, in courtrooms, in the quiet moments when the world seemed to turn against him. "Fear can trick the mind," he said, his voice low and steady, like gravel underfoot. "Makes you see shadows where there's only light. No need to carry it now." But Ms. Henderson shook her head, her eyes glistening. "I hurt you," she pressed, her voice cracking. "I accused you of something awful when you were only trying to help. I caused you pain." Tom tilted his head, considering her words. "You know the truth now," he said simply. "That's enough for me." His forgiveness wasn't forced, it was a choice, rooted in a man who'd seen too much to hold grudges over misunderstandings. General Kern stood at a distance, his arms crossed, his sharp gaze softened by pride. He'd known Tom for decades, had seen him in the crucible of combat and the quiet of civilian life. Even now, vindicated before the town that had doubted him, Tom remained unchanged, a man who valued forward motion over backward glances. The general's chest swelled with a quiet satisfaction, not just for Tom's exoneration, but for the reminder he offered, that character endures when all else falters. As the crowd began to thin, a young reporter from the local paper approached, notebook in hand, eager for a story. "General Kern, can you share more about Sergeant Granger's service?" she asked, her pen poised. The general's eyes flicked toward Tom, who was already moving toward the memorial, oblivious to the conversation. "What I'll tell you," Kern said, his voice firm but warm, "is that Tom Granger embodies the finest of what this country asks of its sons and daughters. He answered the call to serve, fought with courage when the world demanded it, and came home to serve his community in ways most never noticed. That's the measure of the man." A week later, the memorial in the heart of the square stood as it always had, its stone polished, its bronze gleaming, its flag snapping crisply in the morning breeze. But a new addition caught the light. A small bronze plaque near the base, its inscription, a quiet testament to a man who'd never sought it. This memorial is maintained by Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Granger, USM Silver Star recipient. We failed to recognize him for too long. We will not forget again. Tom had fought the plaque's installation, his voice gruff with protest at city council meetings. This place is for the fallen, he'd argued, his jaw tight. Not for me. But the council, moved by his humility and their own growth, had overruled him. The plaque stayed, a permanent acknowledgement of a man who'd stood guard over memory when no one else did. Every morning at Euro 700, Tom continued his ritual. He arrived with his bucket of cleaning supplies, his hands moving with practiced care over the stone, the bronze, the flagpole. The work grounded him, a tether to the men whose names were carved into the monument, friends, brothers, heroes who'd never come home. But now he wasn't always alone. Word of his story had spread through the local VFW and American Legion posts, carried on whispers of respect. Other veterans began to join him, their own worn hands taking up rags and brushes. They worked in silence, a quiet brotherhood forming around the memorial, bound by shared sacrifice and unspoken understanding. Tom welcomed them with a nod, never one for speeches, but his heart stirred at the sight of others tending the names he'd honored alone for so long. One morning, Officer Patterson's cruiser rolled to a stop near the square. The young policeman stepped out, a paper cup of coffee in hand, steam curling into the crisp air. He approached Tom, who was knelt by the memorial, polishing the plaque despite his protests about its existence. "Morning, Sergeant," Patterson said, offering the coffee with a small smile. Tom glanced up, accepting the cup with a grunt of thanks. "Morning, officer. Quiet night?" Patterson nodded, leaning against a nearby bench. "Quiet enough." He hesitated, his fingers tapping the edge of his belt. "I've been thinking about what happened in court," he admitted, his voice softer now. "The way we all got it wrong about you. I learned something that day, about jumping to conclusions, about not really seeing people, just looking at them." Tom kept working, his rag moving in slow, deliberate circles, but he was listening. He'd learned that lesson himself, years ago, in moments of life and death where assumptions could cost everything. "Good lesson," he said at last, his tone even. "Took me a while to learn it too." They fell into a comfortable silence, watching the morning commuters bustle past, most oblivious to the memorial and the men beside it. Patterson shifted, his boots scuffing the pavement. "Would it be all right if I stopped by sometimes?" he asked, his eyes on the names etched in stone. "Maybe learn about the people here?" Tom paused, turning to look at the officer. He saw no pity in Patterson's face, only a genuine curiosity, a desire to understand. "Be honored to tell their stories," Tom said, his voice rough but warm. "They deserve to be known by more than just an old Marine." Tom Granger had never sought the spotlight. He'd shown up every day, not for praise, but to honor men who could no longer speak. When the system turned on him, when a moment of kindness was twisted into a crime, he'd faced it with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through war. He hadn't fought the accusations with anger or defiance, but with silence, not out of weakness, but because he knew his truth didn't need shouting. It took a 4-star general to remind the town that heroes don't always wear medals or uniforms. Sometimes they wear faded jackets and carry invisible scars, standing watch over memory when no one else does. Tom's sacrifice wasn't measured by his age or his worn clothes, but by the steadfastness of his heart, a heart that kept showing up, day after day, to honor those who couldn't. Thomas Granger, at 74, carried the weight of his years, not in his slightly stooped shoulders, but in the quiet resolve etched into his weathered face. Each morning he rose before dawn, driven by a sense of duty that had never faded since his days as a Marine. The Veterans Memorial, a modest patch of hallowed ground in the heart of town, was his sanctuary. He tended to it with meticulous care, polishing the names engraved in stone, names of men and women he'd known, fought alongside, and lost. To Tom, this was no mere task. It was a sacred promise to ensure their sacrifices were not erased by time or indifference. He felt their presence in the cool granite, their stories whispering to him as he worked. Yet beneath his steady hands, a flicker of loneliness stirred. He didn't seek praise or gratitude, but the growing apathy of passers-by stung, a silent accusation that his efforts and the lives he honored no longer mattered. General David Kern, a four-star general whose chest gleamed with ribbons, carried a different burden. His testimony about Tom's heroism wasn't just a formality, it was a debt he felt deep in his bones. Decades ago, Tom had saved his life in a firefight, a moment seared into Kern's memory with the clarity of a photograph. He could still hear the crack of gunfire, feel the weight of Tom dragging him to safety. Now, standing before a courtroom, Kern's voice trembled, not with fear but with righteous anger. He saw in Tom's quiet service the embodiment of everything he'd fought for, and the accusation against his old friend felt like a betrayal of the very values they'd both sworn to uphold. Kern's heart ached as he spoke, knowing that words, even from a man of his rank, might not be enough to undo the damage done to Tom's name. Sarah Henderson, the young woman who accused Tom of assault, was a storm of conflicting emotions. Her accusation wasn't born of malice, but of a fleeting moment of fear, amplified by a world that had taught her to be wary. She'd seen Tom at the memorial, his intense focus mistaken for something threatening. In that split second, her heart raced, and her mind filled the gaps with assumptions. Later, as the truth unraveled, guilt gnawed at her. She replayed the moment endlessly, wondering how she'd misread a man whose life was devoted to protecting others. Sarah felt trapped. Her accusation had spiraled beyond her control, and now she faced the weight of a community's judgment. She wanted to apologize, to make things right, but fear of backlash kept her silent, her regret a heavy shadow she couldn't shake. Officer Bradley Patterson, the policeman who arrested Tom, felt the handcuffs click with a pang of unease. His training demanded he act swiftly, but something about Tom's calm dignity, the way he didn't resist, the quiet pride in his eyes, made Bradley question the narrative he'd been given. As he drove Tom to the station, he stole glances at the old man in the rearview mirror, noting the faded Marine tattoo on his arm. Bradley's father had been a veteran, and the resemblance stirred a quiet discomfort. He wondered if he'd been too quick to judge, if he'd failed to see the man beneath the accusation. That night, lying awake, Bradley wrestled with the thought that his actions might have tarnished a hero's legacy, a thought that left him restless and searching for redemption. David Martinez, Tom's public defender, saw in his client a rare kind of integrity. Young and idealistic, David was used to defending people who blurred the lines of right and wrong. But Tom was different. The old man's quiet refusal to speak ill of Sarah, even in private, struck David as both noble and frustrating. He pored over the case late into the night, driven by a burning need to prove Tom's innocence. Each detail he uncovered, the dog tags, the decades of service, the general's testimony, felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, one that revealed a man who had spent his life shielding others. David's admiration grew, but so did his fear that the truth might not be enough in a world quick to judge. He felt the weight of Tom's trust, a responsibility that pushed him to fight harder than he ever had before. Judge Patricia Walker presided over the case with a heavy heart. Her courtroom had seen countless stories of guilt and innocence, but Tom's case lingered in her mind. She observed the old man's quiet composure, the way he sat with hands folded, as if shielding himself from the world's misjudgment. Patricia prided herself on her impartiality, but the evidence, General Kern's impassioned testimony, the boy's observation of the dog tags, challenged her to look beyond the accusation. She felt a quiet anger at how easily a life of service could be overshadowed by a single misunderstanding. As she prepared her ruling, Patricia reflected on the fragility of truth, how it often needed a champion to bring it into the light. Her decision would be more than a verdict. It would be a chance to restore a man's honor. Marcus Collins, the teenager who noticed Tom's military dog tags, was a quiet observer with a sharp eye. He'd been at the memorial, sketching in his notebook, when he saw the glint of metal around Tom's neck. Something about the old man's reverence for the stones caught Marcus's attention, stirring a curiosity he couldn't ignore. When he overheard whispers of the accusation, his stomach twisted. He knew those dog tags meant something. His father had worn similar ones. Marcus felt a surge of protectiveness, a need to speak up for the man who seemed to carry so much history in his silence. His small act of noticing, of telling his father, felt like the first ripple in a pond, a chance to set things right. For Marcus, it was a moment of growing up. of realizing that even a kid could make a difference. Captain Robert Collins, Marcus's father and a retired Marine, felt a jolt of recognition when his son described Tom. The dog tags, the way the old man tended the memorial, it all pointed to a brother in arms. Robert tracked Tom down, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. When he saw Tom, memories of their shared service flooded back. Nights under fire, promises to never forget. Robert's voice cracked as he identified Tom in court, not just as a Marine, but as a man who'd never stopped serving. He felt a fierce pride in his son for noticing what others had overlooked, but also a deep sorrow that Tom had been forced to endure such humiliation. For Robert, vindicating Tom was personal, a chance to honor the unspoken bond that tied them together. Tom Granger's story wasn't one of parades or medals. He didn't ask for recognition, only for the chance to keep serving in his quiet way, to protect the memories of those who could no longer speak for themselves. His vindication came not from his own voice, but from those who saw him truly. A general, a boy, a fellow Marine. Their words pulled his story from the shadows, reminding the world that heroes often walk unnoticed, their deeds buried under routine and misunderstanding. Tom's heart, bruised but unbroken, found solace in knowing that some still remembered, that his life's work wasn't in vain. For everyone else, his story was a call to pause, to look closer at the quiet guardians among us, and to speak up when their truth deserves to be heard.